Right, welcome back. We are in the middle of our conversation now with the panel that's joined the Minister of Mineral Resources, Minister Susan Shabangu, and we've heard from two of the other panel members, Ambassador Welile Nhlapo, who's the chairman of the Kimberley Process, as well as Mr. Avi Paz, who's the president of the World Diamond Council. But joining us now as well on the panel is from the Civil Society Coalition. And I guess civil society very much part of this conversation because they see things from another perspective, human rights and those kinds of things, very important and close to them. Well, let's get a comment from Shamiso Mtisi. Welcome to the program once again. 10 years on, 99% of the world trade in diamonds covered by the Kimberley Process. By and large, good news.
Thank you very much. I think what is important is to realize that there's need to understand the changing nature of what we mean by conflict diamonds. I think we have had instances of situations where human rights violations are being committed either by state actors or non-state actors. When we say non-state actors, that includes even private security guards in mining areas. We've had situations where communities get displaced, and as a result, it creates a lot of conflict. And that aspect is not captured within the Kimberley Process, and it is quite important for the Kimberley Process to capture and redefine what we mean by conflict diamond. So that is one important aspect that we as civil society, we believe should actually be taken up by the Kimberley Process and be included in the definition. We've seen slow movement by the Kimberley Process in redefining what we mean by conflict diamond. And then secondly, the other issue is around transparency and accountability, which is being denied by some members within the Kimberley Process that it's not an aspect worth looking at. It is quite important because communities out there, national economies out there would want to benefit from the diamonds. So the issue of diamonds and development is quite important in this discourse because you would not want to see a situation where diamonds are being mined, being exported without benefiting the real people in terms of infrastructural development and in terms of all the other associated benefits. Then also, what is important for civil society is to make sure that there is equality and fair treatment of each other within the Kimberley Process in terms of the respect of the role of civil society. Because we often go out there to meet the communities, we often get views from the communities, and the communities actually talk about the changing nature of conflicts. It's no longer, in some cases, about rebel movements wielding guns, but it is about private security guards or state actors, be they the police or the military, beating up people. So those are the kind of instances that we are saying the Kimberley Process has to look at because the nature of conflicts have changed. Then the other thing about the Kimberley Process is the need to make sure that information goes out there to the people. Yes, we have noted the improved availability of information on the Kimberley Process website, but there's need to do more in terms of disclosure of the production from the different mines, maybe in a disaggregated manner. And in that respect, we are saying the Kimberley Process can work progressively with other initiatives like the Extractive Industries Program, as well as other related aspects that are quite important. So from a civil society perspective, those are some of the issues that we are talking about.
All right, so thank you very much, Mr. Mtisi. I wonder, Ambassador, he's raised an interesting point. You know, when I went onto your website, the core Kimberley Process document says that blood diamonds, rough diamonds used by rebel movements and allies to fund conflicts aimed at undermining legitimate governments. Have we outlived that definition?
That definition arose out of a concrete historical condition where rebel movements began to have access to diamonds in order to overthrow governments in countries where that resource was available. The history of Angola tells us exact story. Liberia will tell you the same story, Cote d'Ivoire and others, Sierra Leone. it was within that historical context that there had to be a measured response and to capture exactly the nature of the problem that was confronting those countries. The diamond being used as a driver of that conflict. The conflict was not about diamonds. It was a conflict for power. There was a political process. Diamonds were just a means that rebel movements, because of their illegal activities, because of the operations that they've been involved in not being acceptable, because of their illegal nature, then blended into a web of illegal operations with smugglers and anything, because diamonds have been smuggled long before they became a driver of conflict. And therefore, that definition was born out of that, to clarify that situation. But because of the conditions under which and the way diamonds were brought into the conflict, in the course of time, in addressing this sketch and this flow, a conflict prevention element kicked into the operations of the Kimberley process and began to engage conflicts in a larger sense, which are basically political, economic, social, military in nature. Talking about armed conflicts. And even at that time when the Kimberley process emerged, already you had international instruments, particularly in the United Nations, that were already dealing with those conflicts, although in a limited way. Where civil society even came in at the time was to raise the alarm about the use of diamonds in fueling these conflicts and the slow response from those organizations that had the mandate and the resources to do so, like the United Nations and its organs. That was their first that thing. Even the film on blood diamonds, the essence of it was to draw attention to the indifference and the limited response to a growing calamity from the organizations that have got the mandate to maintain peace and security. I think we need to separate these things. We do recognize the social function of the civil society. But civil society is abroad. That's why they call themselves a coalition. Some of them have got political objectives. I don't know why they don't become political parties so that it becomes clear what they are all about. So all these issues are brought together, but it's understandable because what we are dealing with is a context in which we are trying to manage the flow of these diamonds, to stem them so that they don't land into wrong hands.
Okay.
And of course, all those issues of governance and all those things, because that is the context. So we deal with them with that clear understanding that is the context and that we've got a limited space in which you can make a contribution, and we do exactly what you can do best within that space without broadening and entering into the sphere of others who have got the legal mandate and the resources to respond to these issues.
All right. Minister,
we're just a scheme,
okay,
not an organization.
Minister, let me turn to you. I mean, on the back of that, it is a scheme, it's not an organization, and a lot of reliance is placed on each country to adhere to minimum standards. Now, again, that definition talks about undermining legitimate governments by people who might have different interests. My question now to you is, what do you do with those legitimate governments that are sometimes part of the problem? How do you manage them? Because they are the members, they are the participating members. So I can trade with them, but they are part of the problem.
Well, I must say that the Kimberley process has clear mechanisms to deal with legitimate governments which are not compliant with the Kimberley process. As we've seen in some spaces, where there have been legitimate governments who are not compliant. Hence, a process and the mechanisms have been put in place to make sure that every country which produces diamond does comply with the Kimberley Process Certification Schemes. That's the purpose. But also I think what we've got to understand is that legitimate governments on themselves, they have various processes, they have various regulatory mechanisms as countries. So Kimberley Process becomes a complementary to what exists within those countries. And I must say that through the Kimberley Process, if indeed there is a concern about legitimate governments not being able to follow the due processes, the Kimberley Process kicks in a process which then goes through a particular process where a review is done with the particular country and make sure that they are compliant. When they are not, there are particular mechanisms which are put in place, there are sanctions, there are processes, because all of us have to be accountable as various governments. So I would say where we are today, we know that there are countries which have been barred to participate. There are countries which have been required to comply with the Kimberley Process.
Who's doing the auditing?
The auditing is done through the Kimberley Process. It set up its own process. It set up a team and appoints various countries who are members of the Kimberley Process to go and do a due diligence of those countries.
So it's members watching themselves, essentially?
Well, it's members. You can't say it's members watching themselves, because it's country representatives who set up a committee which then goes out following all the statutes of the Kimberley Process that that particular country do comply. Hence, it's acceptable that when the findings happens, then they come up with recommendations which then are implemented. That is why we've seen that in Zimbabwe, we've seen that in Venezuela, we've seen that in various countries, because it's not only that. Various countries are reviewed on a regular basis, review their own regulatory framework, review what they're doing in each country, and then on the basis of that, the Kimberley Process, through its chair at a particular point in time, will say this country is compliant as defined by the statutes.
Okay, Mr. Paz, I want to come to you. World Diamond Council, I mean, you have an interest in this process because you want diamonds to be flowing constantly. So the question that people might have is that, look, you are going to bend over backwards to make sure that perhaps some countries that should stop flowing their diamonds, somehow we get certification pushed through. How can we trust that somebody who really wants these diamonds to come into the market is working hard to make sure that those diamonds are completely clean, and that perhaps some shortcuts are not being taken?
Well, first of all, there are sanctions that are taken by governments. People who are trade with conflict diamonds are subjected to sanctions by the own government, but also, you know, most of the diamantiers are working through diamond exchanges. There are 28 diamond exchanges. There was the World Federation of Diamond Bursars, who there are 25,000 people working to the World Federation of Diamond Exchanges, and through this organization, there are also sanctions that they are taking. People who are expelled from the World Federation of Diamond Bursars can't work anymore in the diamond business. So we are very careful and very aware about it. And it's not we don't want those people working with us. We will make sure that the people who are working are clean and work as they should work.
Mr. Mtisi, we're hearing a very compelling case for the Kimberley Process. Apart from the definitions that you want changed, is there anything else that concerns you? Because otherwise, it sounds like we're doing not too bad.
Yes, there are several other issues that we are concerned about. Minister Shabangu talked about the review visits. I think what is quite important is to assess whether the recommendations, for example, of those review visits have been implemented. That's quite important. And the effectiveness of the review visits is one of the key aspects that as civil society we are currently studying to see if the review visits that have been done in several countries were effective and the recommendations thereof are being implemented. That's quite important. It's one thing to go on a review visit and then make some recommendations. Next year, the recommendations are not implemented. So it's another aspect that's quite important. And then also, from a civil society perspective, if you look at the civil society organizations that are within the KP, we do not hold anyone's mandate in terms of political agenda or whatsoever. Some of us actually have relatives who are affected by diamond mining, and that's quite important. So we do not hold any agenda or any political affiliation whatsoever. It's quite important that communities who are affected have representatives or people who go down on the ground and pick issues, pick the concerns, raising alarm, like the ambassador said earlier on, that civil society raised alarm. And this is what we are doing. We are not creating situations where of violence where it doesn't exist. We talk about real issues. So it's quite important for the role of civil society to be recognized. And then also the other aspect is around, that we are concerned about, is around enforcement and compliance with internal control measures that are normally put in place by the governments themselves through laws. Right? So the KP has got minimum standards, and then it also has recommendations. Right? So as civil society, we are saying there's need to improve compliance with those internal control measures that have been put in place by different countries. We have situations in West Africa where compliance with internal control measures have weakened, and that's why we are talking about a regional approach. So those are the kind of issues that we are raising within the Kimberley process.
Ambassador Nhlapo?
I think it is correct to recognize one truth, is that you are dealing with diamond producing countries which are at different levels of development, including the state institutions and the capacity to comply. And one of the reasons about the review system is to ensure that they are able to comply. And you review the state systems, the functions of the different state organs that have a role in this whole process of certification, as to where the challenges are, some of the difficulties that they might have. Some countries request to be reviewed. It's a peer review system. They request to be reviewed so that they can be checked as to how far they are with their compliance. And if there are challenges that they are faced with, there's an element of solidarity that kicks in. Those who have the capacity to help do help those countries. Now in this continent, as you know, many countries, when they got their independence, inherited weak constitutions and weak states. There's still a whole process of state building. I'm not talking about countries that have gone through conflict, where state machinery had collapsed and have to be rebuilt. And part of the contribution that the Kimberley process can do in the countries that have gone through conflicts where diamonds have been identified as one of the drivers, one of them, not one of the drivers, we can be able, through these compliance requirements, to assist in the restoration of the capacity of the state to perform certain functions which will be of benefit in other things, like revenue collection. For instance, this certificate has to indicate the value, and the trade is done through the customs. They collect revenue from that, so it means their revenue system must be up to scratch. Their customs regime must be up to scratch. Indirectly, that is a contribution we make. We don't legislate. Countries are expected to legislate to ensure that everything is done legally within legislative framework and regulatory frameworks. And it is upon those countries to do their best. And they've got to be assisted, taking into consideration their historical conditions, and the challenges that they faced in terms of capacity to govern in general and the specific demands of the Kimberley process in regulating the flow and the import and exports of their diamonds.
All right, okay. We're going to unpack quite a bit more of that. You've raised a few questions, certainly in my mind. But after the break, we're going to come back and we're going to go to the floor and start getting some of the questions that have been raised by panelists here. And then we'll also check up and see what your thoughts are at home. All of that still to come. Stay with us.